Is there a connection between usury and the obsession with profits being satanic and shaitan promising poverty? There is an argument that one of the greatest causes of inequality in wealth in Western countries is due to the use of debt and interest rates. Is the Quran saying that this financial system and moral precedent of taking advantage of people's needs leads to poverty, not just for particular individuals, but for the majority of society? And then the second question is, one of the well-known scholars of Islamic finance has defined riba as usury amounting to economic exploitation rather than simple increase, particularly of the modest kind provided for according to modern banking practice. Is this correct? Does riba refer only to high interest rates and not low interest rates? And what do we do with the small amount of money given to us by banks in the form of interest? And then related to that is the whole idea of fintech, or cryptocurrency, non-fungible tokens, decentralized finance, which is still new and still little understood. To that end, what is the main moral principle in verses 275 to 281 that we can use to navigate new financial practices and instruments? And I guess as an aside, I would share this email that we got also, that one of your students had asked, or had alerted us to the Indonesian Ulama Council issuing a fatwa on the prohibition of cryptocurrency, and that the argument of the council is very simple. It's based on gharar and maisir, uncertainty and gambling, and was wondering what your opinion was on cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the such, and the like. So.
Okay, so the first part of the question about
obsession with profits being satanic and shaitan promising poverty.
You know, a lot of people actually they don't know that in the history of the common law and in the history of Jewish law, these two, there have been a very rich discussion on precisely what usury is and the prohibition against usury. And if I would sum it up, in both, it is an increase in money that is exploitative, that basically takes advantage of the needs of others to further their position of disempowerment. Now, what happened with modern financial institutions is that in the common law system and as well in the civil law system, the prohibition against usury, like the concept of pornography, like the concept in American law of legal entrapment, became basically meaningless. Although the Constitution prohibits entrapment, but the way the entrapment law have been interpreted, it has become entirely meaningless. Same thing with pornography. You know, till now, being obscene, the law prohibits obscenity, but the vast majority of what is pornographic material is not deemed obscene. And till now, technically speaking, if you wanted to go to the common law tradition or the non-statutory law, exacting usurious interest rates is not allowed. The problem is that the statutes and regulations basically have allowed institutions to set interest rates that sometimes are extremely high. When I go back to the historical dynamic, now of course, yeah, the Muslim jurists developed this whole thing about Riba al Fadl, Riba al Nasi'a, and that's a whole, and we could have a very interesting discussion focused on legal history and the history of the discourses on Riba al Fadl and Riba al Nasi'a. And Muslim jurists, generally speaking, were animated by two considerations. Some of them were animated by a very literal understanding of the tradition that you can't trade something for something of the same nature for an increase. And so they obsess about, well, is this equal to this? Is this the same thing as this? So I can't give you $10, and in return you give me $11. But the two main considerations that animated Muslim jurists, other than the sort of very literal understanding of two things of the same nature, is profits without labor, and increase on or financial increases that represent exploitation of the needs of others. So Muslim jurists were definitely suspect of the idea of profits without labor. And that is why some of them in the classical tradition even prohibited rentals. That, you're renting the house. Well, what labor, the reason what labor goes into that. And it took a long evolutionary process until the Hanafis eventually accepted rentals and said, well, financial institutions have to force us to allow to accept the idea that you can't always expect profit with labor, or you can't tie the two together without it becoming a serious financial obstacle. The part that became is they struggled with this element of exploitation. How do we define exploitation when we are talking about, financial transactions that could take place any place in the Muslim world, whether in Egypt or in Medina or in Mecca or in Damascus or in Baghdad, and with imperfect information about who are coming to these financial transactions. So the way that then they try to approach it is to set rules for increase that would represent the increase in debts. I think if what the Quran, you go back to the Quranic, what the Quran was responding to, and what the Quran was responding to was exploitative institutions that not just took advantage of people's need, but that embedded people in their position of economic disadvantage. That if you are economically disadvantaged, you will remain economically disadvantaged. Now, if you put aside the technicalities of law, and again, I think it is important that we put aside the technicalities of law, and we go back to Quranic morality. What was the Quran trying to achieve morally? not the mechanics of law. The Quran was clearly, whether when it talks about, you ought to lend people money and just be patient with them. You ought to lend people money and forgive it. You have to take care of the orphans and the poor and the wayfarer and so on. Or it talks about that, if you can't insult the dignity of people or degrade people, and if you go to degrade people, then it's better not to, then keep your money to yourself. What the Quran was consistently doing, morally speaking, is that to uplift people's dignity and their social mobility, their ability to come out of a position of a disadvantaged human being. Now, why am I emphasizing this? Because from that perspective, any financial arrangement that keeps the poor stuck to their poverty is immoral from a Quranic perspective, regardless of the technicalities. So we make these financial Islamic banking arrangements. I mean, I've worked on several cases where I've testified as an expert witness in Islamic banking cases, and we structure it where you buy the home, and I buy the home, and then I'm effectively buying the home back from you, but ultimately I end up in the couple of cases that I've worked on, and actually there were more than a couple, but anyway, effectively I end up buying the home back or for far more than you've bought it, and I am bearing a much higher risk than if I would have gotten a regular mortgage. How is that consistent with the morality of the prohibition? Forget the technicalities of it. Without question, much of the interest rate that is charged by credit cards is usurious, because once you are in debt, you will remain in debt, and it is a whole structure of the system is structured to keep you in that cycle. From an Islamic perspective, it is immoral, but so is any other institution that keeps, what in Arabic parlance they say, the basha, a basha. What keeps the master a master, and the master is always dealing from a position of benevolence, choice benevolence towards the dependent. If we would get beyond the mechanics of the law to the moral message of the Quran, I think we would start seeing things far more clearly. So, listen. Among the things that in the modern work environment, in so many institutions in the West, there is, I'm not saying that the West has solved the problem of sexual harassment by far, and not even close, but what I'm saying is that there are situations that I've witnessed in Egypt and in some other Arab countries where the employee is so disempowered that there is no way to really redress sexual exploitation by the employer. I've had a student once from Iran came to me, told me a story that about her, what happened to her by her employer, who forced her to do horrible things. Because if she had no recourse, and if she would have left the job, it would have had horrible consequences for her children. So she was forced into a very degrading situation. I've seen that in Egypt, I've seen that in other Muslim countries. And when I compare this to the relative empowerment of employees in the West who know their rights, who know that they can go to an attorney and can, sue their attorney and etc., sue their employer. And believe me, I looked at this as hardcore, as in its very core, as relevant to what the Quran says about riba. Far more than the technical issue of interest rate, and that, because it is talking about who's exploiting who. And it, as a Muslim, the fact that it just shows how far we've drifted from the morality of the Quran. The Quran is saying, don't leave people in a disempowered position across the board. Don't put people at the mercy of other people. That's what it's all about. Because there are very nice people, but there are also very evil people. And if evil people can hurt those that depend on them without recourse, and it is not enough to say, well, they could go to the police. Yeah, but what if you suffer from racial and class and gender divisions that makes going to the police entirely ineffective? That is not consistent with the morality of the Quran. And the sooner we get our children to understand that the Quran was about a moral project, not a legal project, to teach our children to be offended by injustice the way that the Quran was offended by injustice, I think maybe Allah's disappointment with us, maybe it will start being lifted. Maybe Allah will, I've often wondered, why do other societies just so happen to get, the U.S., if the U.S. didn't have George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as, among their first president, the entire U.S. experiment would have gone to hell. There were a lot of authoritarians, but there were enough level-headed people. Look at Israel. This I can't, and the founding fathers of Israel, and of course women as well. Why did they get people who were, for their purposes, on the right moral trajectory, for their purposes, with everything they've done to others, while we get, the likes of leaders that we get in the Muslim world? Can you imagine if the United States would have had Abdul Nasser as its founding father, or Sadat, or Mubarak? I can assure you, nothing would have become of the United States. People make a difference. The right person, the right historical moment makes a difference. And this is the part where I just, it just can't be a simple coincidence. It can't be. Moshe Dayan grew up in the house right in front of Abdul Nasser. They lived across the street from each other in Egypt. Moshe Dayan grew up in Egypt. And what Moshe Dayan did for Israel and his morality vis-a-vis his people, as opposed to Abdul Nasser's morality vis-a-vis his people, Moshe Dayan's Jewishness, as opposed to Abdul Nasser's absolute lack of Islamic anything. It just, I don't know. You have to reflect on these things. You can't just let them pass.
Sorry, we have to backtrack a little bit because we skipped the second part of the financial question, which had to do with cryptocurrency.
The
yeah.
cryptocurrency. Oh, I completely forgot about.
So just again, just
okay.
do you want me? To
Okay, no, I remember. So okay, so let me just in Indonesia there was this whole discussion about cryptocurrency, and then a fatwa, a very well known fatwa, was issued by a group of ulama that prohibited cryptocurrency, and the fatwa itself doesn't say much other than that it is gharar, and gharar means speculation. Initially the response to the stock market, there's a famous Azhari fatwa that I don't remember whether it was 1930s or 1940s, that said that the stock market is haram because of gharar. And then eventually it was dropped. And I don't claim that I really understand the world of cryptocurrency that well, but so it requires but from what I understand, it would seem to me that so much of modern currency, which doesn't, obviously we all know, doesn't rely on a gold standard, and it really, so much of modern currency, it privileges the currency backed up by former colonial powers, particularly the dollar and the euro. For a short while, the yen was also part of it, but because of but I don't think the yen is now. And when we say this, it's not just that a government says, I am supporting the value of this currency. In other words, a government is saying, I promise that that I am absolutely sort of the ultimate fallback for the value of this currency. But a lot of people ignore the fact that to our modern day age, a lot of all the derivative currencies, all the currencies that you find in different countries of the world, ultimately rely on the power of the dollar as a dominant currency in the world. And so our modern currency system clearly privileges a particular superpower and former colonial powers in Europe. A lot of things, if you want to export or import anything, you have to do it in hard currency. You can't do it in your local currency. So in many ways, local currencies are sort of good fictions for local populations. But if you get beyond your local populations and go to the world market, it is hard currency, meaning the currency of superpowers that actually matters, not your little local currency. Now, why do I say this? Because currency itself, it is A, based on a number of fictions, and B, we cannot ignore the fact that they privilege centers of power. And that is why, if you notice, the United States goes at great length to very aggressively combat any country that says, I will start doing the business in other than the dollar. And this is, again, just part of the world we live in. Now, the stock market itself, although there is an underlying company that is supposed to be the basis of the stocks that you sell and buy, there have been a lot of studies about to what extent the underlying company actually really matters, rather than a whole bunch of complicated systems of fictions that create the price of these stocks. And so if it is the idea of gharar, then that's invalid. Because the same gharar exists in stocks, the same gharar exists in currency that exists in cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency has had a potential of democratizing, taking some of the power out of traditional monopolistic centers of economic power. Unfortunately, although cryptocurrency seems to be something that can be created democratically anywhere in the world, again, most of where cryptocurrency companies have popped up have been the West, particularly the United States. I would just strongly urge Muslims, instead of focusing on saying it's haram, think of ways that perhaps you can co-opt the practice to empower Muslims. If cryptocurrency is what, then why can't Muslims back up their own cryptocurrencies? So, instead of all of us live, whether we like it or not, all of us live at the mercy of the dollar, and to a much lesser extent, the euro. The American stock market, and if just a few handful of stock markets in the world, controls the rest of the economic pulse of the world. Cryptocurrency is coming in and complicated this picture. You can't produce a fiqhi response without taking that into account. I'm not saying I'm just saying take it into account. Be sophisticated. When you analyze something, analyze it from all its sophisticated aspects. Just saying it's gharar, well, then there's so much gharar that surrounds our lives and everything. And everything. If you want to really launch a revolution against gharar, then you're going to have to become far more. You're going to have to be far stronger in the world economy to actually be able to reshape the world on a non-gharar principle. But the world we live in is Muslims are on the tail end of things. I mean, all their economic wealth, it is even in all the wealth of the countries that most Muslims belong to, their wealth is invested in the West. Living, breathing, eating gharar all the time. including Indonesia's economy and Malaysia's economy. So it just seems to be, again, typically just, even if I say a typically Muslim response, immediately everyone knows that what I'm saying is that it's a typically simplistic, naive response. Why do we have to be like that? Why can't we get to the point where we say, it's a Muslim response. It means it's a sophisticated, complicated, really smart response. Why? I don't know.